Hey, it's Dr. Christopher, and before you scroll past this one, I need you to sit with a number for a second. Right now, in 2026, more than 20 states have already told people on food assistance they are not allowed to buy soda or candy with those benefits anymore, and the man behind it says the reason is simple: we have been using your tax dollars to make people sick and then billing you again to treat them. That is not a conspiracy theory floating around some corner of the internet. That is now written into actual state policy in places like Iowa, Utah, Nebraska, Indiana, and West Virginia, with more than a dozen other states lined up behind them and even more joining through the spring of this year. And it is only the opening chapter of what might be the biggest shakeup of the American food system in half a century. So stick with me all the way through, because at least a few of these 10 changes are sitting in your kitchen cabinet or your fridge door right now, and one of them might genuinely surprise you by the end. First up, the food dyes, the ones that make cereal look like a rainbow, exploded and turn a snack cake that shade of unnatural blue nothing in nature actually produces on its own. The push right now is to get petroleum-based dyes like Red 40, Yellow 5, Yellow 6, Blue 1, Blue 2, and Green 3 out of the food supply by the end of this year, with a couple of lesser-known dyes already pulled outright and red dye number 3 on a legal countdown to being gone from food entirely by early 2027 and out of medications by 2028. Now here's the part that should make you a little uneasy. This is not being forced through Congress with some sweeping new law. Most of it is what's called a voluntary agreement, meaning food companies shook hands at a press conference and said they'd cooperate, which means the actual timeline depends a whole lot on how badly a company wants to keep selling you Skittles the exact same shade they've always been. And a couple of the biggest food trade groups have already been vague on paper about committing to the full 2026 deadline. The research behind this goes back to a well-known 2007 study out of the United Kingdom that tested over 300 children between the ages of 3 and the age range of 8 to 9, giving some of them a drink mix with artificial dyes and a common preservative, and finding a measurable jump in hyperactivity and attention problems compared to kids who got the plain version. And that single study is a big part of why the rest of the developed world moved on from these dyes years before the United States did. Second, and this is the one that hits people where they actually live, the food stamp program itself, officially called SNAP, is getting an overhaul. States are now allowed to ask the federal government for permission to block soda and candy purchases on those benefits, and permission is being granted left and right. More than 20 states now have approval, with restrictions ranging from just soda in one state to soda, candy, and a whole list of prepared snack foods in another. The argument is that a program meant to feed hungry families shouldn't be quietly funding the sugar that fuels obesity and type 2 diabetes in those same households. Critics call it controlling and say it punishes people for being poor by narrowing their choices without actually making healthy food any cheaper or more available. And honestly, that criticism has some real teeth to it. Cutting off soda doesn't magically put fresh produce within walking distance of a family living in a food desert. But ask yourself this: if a government program existed that handed out free cigarettes alongside groceries, would we call it paternalistic to end that, or would we call it common sense finally catching up? Third on the list, high fructose corn syrup, the sweetener hiding in everything from sandwich bread to salad dressing to barbecue sauce. The push here is to get it out of school meals and government food programs first. Partly because corn itself is so heavily subsidized by federal farm policy that syrup made from it ends up artificially cheap, cheaper in some product categories than plain sugar, which quietly nudges the entire food industry toward using more of it in more products. And higher intake of it is strongly linked with the exact metabolic problems: obesity, fatty liver, insulin resistance that are now showing up in kids who are barely old enough to read a cereal box, let alone the ingredient label on the back of it. Fourth, seed oils, and I want to be careful here because this is genuinely one of the more heated, unresolved debates in nutrition science right now. The argument against oils like soybean, corn, canola, and sunflower is that they are extremely high in omega-6 fatty acids, and when omega-6 intake badly outweighs omega-3 intake, which it does in the standard American diet by a wide margin, some researchers believe that imbalance promotes low-grade, chronic inflammation that plays a role in heart disease, insulin resistance, and possibly cognitive decline over time. Mainstream nutrition organizations push back hard on this framing and point to a large body of research showing these oils actually lower cholesterol markers when they replace butter or lard in a diet. So the honest, unglamorous answer is that the science here isn't fully settled either way, but the policy push regardless is to get these oils out of school lunches and swap in options like olive oil, avocado oil, and butter instead. And whichever side of that ongoing debate you personally land on, cutting deep-fried, heavily reused frying oil out of a school cafeteria is a pretty hard thing to argue against. Now here's a quick 60-second favor before we keep rolling. If this kind of breakdown is actually useful to you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which one of these 10 surprised you the most, because apparently the algorithm gods demand a small sacrifice of at least one comment per video, or they hide it from everybody else who might need to see it. So help a guy out. It costs you nothing and it takes about 4 seconds. Fifth, ultra-processed foods, specifically inside public schools. We're talking frozen pizza, chicken nuggets, sugary breakfast cereal, and shelf-stable snack cakes that can apparently survive a nuclear winter sitting in a vending machine untouched. The thing that makes them shelf-stable in the first place is almost always some combination of added sugar, chemical preservatives, and industrial seed oils, and several states have now set actual target dates, some as early as this year, to phase these products out of public school cafeterias in favor of meals built from whole, recognizable ingredients instead. Sixth, artificial sweeteners, aspartame, sucralose, saccharin, and acesulfame potassium. These show up in diet soda, flavored yogurt, protein bars, sugar-free gum, and yes, even in some children's chewable vitamins that get marketed straight to worried parents. The concern being raised is around long-term effects on gut bacteria, and some animal studies suggesting a possible cancer link at very high sustained doses. Though it's worth being fully honest here that human data on this remains genuinely mixed, and regulatory bodies in both the United States and Europe still classify most of these sweeteners as safe within normal daily limits. So right now, the actual approach on the table is public education campaigns rather than any outright ban, which honestly might be the more responsible, measured move, given how unsettled the research still is on this particular topic. Seventh, and this one is genuinely wild once you understand how it actually works, there's a decades-old regulatory loophole called generally recognized as safe, originally meant back in the 1950s for obvious kitchen staples like salt and vinegar that nobody reasonably needed to test. But today, that same loophole lets a company hire and pay its own outside expert, get a private thumbs up, and start using a brand new chemical compound in your food without ever formally notifying the FDA. No independent third-party review, no public record anyone can search, just an internal sign-off between two private parties, and thousands of additives have quietly entered the American food supply through exactly this path over the years. The current push is to require mandatory FDA notification and genuinely independent testing before any new compound gets anywhere near your family's dinner plate, which frankly sounds like the bare minimum you'd probably assume was already happening long before now. Eighth, raw unpasteurized milk. And I want to be straight with you here because this is the one spot on this whole list where I'll push back a little instead of just reporting it. The argument in favor is that raw milk is closer to its natural state, keeps more of its natural enzymes intact, and some people genuinely find it easier on their stomach than the pasteurized version. But public health agencies have documented real, repeated, serious outbreaks of salmonella, listeria, and E. coli tied directly to raw milk consumption, and those risks are especially dangerous for young kids, pregnant women, older adults, and anyone with a weakened immune system. So if regulations loosen up and allow easier sales across state lines, that is not automatically a clean health win the way some of the other items on this list are. It's a genuine trade-off between personal choice and freedom and a real, well-documented infection risk, and I think you deserve to hear that clearly instead of only getting one side of the story. Ninth, the kids' products dressed up to look like health food on the label, the flavored yogurt tubes and fruit-shaped, cartoon-covered cereals marketed with words like natural and wholesome plastered across the front of the box, when a lot of them actually carry more added sugar per serving than an honest slice of cake would. The push here is to stop these specific products from qualifying under school meal programs and food assistance purchases going forward, because if public money is footing the bill to feed kids, dessert quietly dressed up as breakfast probably shouldn't count toward that. And 10th, processed meats, hot dogs, deli slices, bacon and pepperoni. The concern is sodium nitrite, a preservative that can convert into compounds called nitrosamines once it hits high heat, like a hot grill or a sizzling skillet, and nitrosamines are a well-recognized carcinogen with decades of research behind that link. Now, to be fair, there are smaller producers out there making nitrite-free or naturally cured versions from grass-fed sources that behave differently and far more safely under heat. So this genuinely isn't every hot dog everywhere on every shelf. It's specifically the cheapest, most heavily processed end of that aisle. And the current plan on the table is to get those specific products out of school lunches and assistance programs first, before tackling the broader grocery aisle later. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Denise, and I want to be upfront that her story is a composite stitched together from about a dozen real patients I've heard variations of over the years, so it stays true to the pattern without exposing any one person's private history. Denise was in her late 40s, working 2 jobs and feeding her 3 kids mostly out of the freezer aisle and the school cafeteria menu, because that's genuinely what fit her budget and her exhausted schedule. Her youngest son was labeled hyperactive back in 2nd grade and put on medication before anyone in the room ever once asked what he was actually eating for breakfast that morning. Her own blood work in her late 40s came back showing borderline type 2 diabetes, and when she finally sat down with a nutritionist out of pure frustration, the fix wasn't some exotic superfood or an expensive supplement stack. It was cutting out the dyed cereal, the sugary yogurt tubes, and the daily can of soda, and swapping in plain eggs, plain yogurt, and whole fruit instead. Within about 4 months, her son's teacher pulled her aside and asked what had changed at home, and Denise's own lab numbers had quietly moved back into a normal range without a single prescription added. She didn't need a federal policy to make that change happen for her own kitchen, but she told me flat out afterward that the sugar and the artificial dye were so deeply baked into every cheap, convenient product sitting on the shelf that she genuinely didn't realize there was another option available to her until someone finally sat down and spelled it out plainly. And that, more than any political fight over any single one of these 10 items, is really the heart of the matter. Whether or not you personally trust the man signing off on these particular policies, the underlying question he's forcing the entire country to sit with is a genuinely fair one to ask out loud. Why did it take this long for anyone in Washington to finally say that food is supposed to be food? So tell me down in the comments which of these 10 surprised you the most. Send this over to the person in your life who's still tossing that neon blue sports drink into their kid's lunchbox every single morning without a second thought, and I'll catch you in the next one. This is Dr. Christopher. Stay healthy out there, and I mean that.